While living in New York City in the late 1970s, my mother visited me from Chicago, Illinois. And during her brief stay in Manhattan, we used the subway to visit tourist sites and to see family and friends. I'll never forget that upon entering one of New York's graffiti-covered subway cars, she asked me if someone had been paid to spray paint the interiors and exteriors of those trains. My mother's innocent inquiry, as Bruce Davidson's photograph of a graffiti-covered train car illustrated, pointed to New York's state of affairs as per street art in those quixotic, gritty years. The city's unofficial public art, or in the opinions of many, the urban eyesore that consequently has been the subject of numerous art exhibitions, scholarly studies, and even public policy research papers. Although it seemed to outsiders that these mostly indecipherable spray-painted signatures and permanent marker tags were commissioned, or perhaps the creations of nocturnal gremlins, New Yorkers certainly knew that, like the emergent and conspicuous art forms of rap, hip-hop, and breakdancing at the time, the principal founts for these illicit seismographic tags and insignia were Caribbean American and African American youth and a few of their white emulators. Each gesture, wrote the art historian Robert Ferris Thompson, about this artistic impulse and its reverberations in the critically acclaimed paintings of the artist Jean-Michel Basquiat, is potentially a fugitive from a different art history, adding to Basquiat's incredible velocity. Recognizing graffiti's art historical value, and in the case of Jean-Michel Basquiat, its referential significance, leads one away from its semantic efforts and instead towards its pictorial and painterly effects. An early Basquiat painting, Untitled, underscored how coincident with graffiti's omnipresence in New York City, this 20-something artist channeled his visual energies, first in the direction of the then popular neo-expressionist painting mode, and second, towards seemingly symbolic forms of an improvisational or fugitive variety. The 1981 Untitled, with its jumble of suggestive figures superimposed and undergirded by startling expurgations and offbeat supplements, felt frenzied and, in light of the relatively staid mainstream art world circa 1980, outright renegade, all via Basquiat's graffiti-informed iconography and his motley, clashing palette. But Thompson's different art history was not just in reference to the aesthetics of artists such as Jean-Michel Basquiat. New York's cultural indebtedness to the arts and folkways of the Caribbean and their North American incarnations, as exemplified in that microcosm's performing, literary, and visual expressions, factored into that distinctive account, not only contributing to New York's cultural heterogeneity, as reflected in Basquiat's Haitian and Puerto Rican cultural background, but forming its own art histories, encompassing a subset of late 20th century painting and its practitioners. Graffiti, or in a more inclusive parlance, the art of impromptu, writing-informed wall painting, knows no chronological, cultural, or geographical limits, but a comparable communal art tradition, distinct from its 1970s, 1980s New York variant, had long been operational on the Haitian side of the Greater Antilles island of Hispaniola, whether facades announcing the spiritual proceedings within the buildings they embellished, or spontaneous murals commemorating fallen leaders and endorsing partisan politics. Haiti's walls introduced important lessons about public art, and as suggested in author Selden Rodman's photograph of a pattern-enriched Haitian cahier, they offered illuminations of a rarely explored branch of modern painting, but in this instance, emanating from the Afro-Atlantic cultural sphere. This perambulating from graffiti proper to Jean-Michel Basquiat's artwork, and from Basquiat to modern murals in Haiti, an island of epical disasters, natural and man-made, and of colorful, spiritually imbued art, has its basis in the premise of an ordained imbrication between writing and painting. This is a slide between genres historically accredited to the art of calligraphy, or to modern painters like Cy Twombly. But if viewed through an urban graffiti practice within the trans-Caribbean cultural matrix, this fusion looks different. This is a synthesis that, taking its cues from youthful impulses and the general public's communication networks, transmits these chromatic dispatches via street-savvy, pigment-suffused compositions. It hadn't occurred to me to think about Jean-Michel Basquiat's art in this hybrid way, as skating between acts of inscription and painting, until I began to consider his art in comparison to another artist of the Caribbean diaspora, the Haitian-born, Paris-based artist Hervé Telemaque. Initially looking at both Basquiat's and Telemaque's respective works side by side might not initially give one the impression of them being members of the same school. Whereas Basquiat's reputation, much of his posthumous, has only been a little over 40 years in the making, Telemaque, who began painting and exhibiting his works in the late 1950s, enjoyed 7 decades primarily in Europe as an accomplished and critically recognized artist. Although an ocean apart from each other, Basquiat's 1981 Untitled and Telemaque's more or less coterminous Dérive Une, or Drift One, were essentially of one viewpoint, as exemplified by their idiosyncratic colors and figures facilitating postmodern interpretations of identity. But what especially resonated in both paintings, and what makes Basquiat's and Telemaque's works ideal entry points for this rumination on an affecting art medium, was an unbridled but knowledgeable hand dispensing layers of imagery and a spectrum of pigments onto two-dimensional surfaces that put a spotlight on the creative and transgressive powers of the autographic touch. Sometimes the artist's actors take the form of a figure or groups of figures, wrote the art historian Fred Hoffman about Basquiat's visual reference, but with an observation applicable to Telemaque's performative words and signs as well. Both byproducts within their respective generations of a dispersed Caribbean diaspora and heirs to the visual potential of graffiti and street art. Basquiat and Telemaque felt kinships with the modern metropole's artists flaneurs and their text and icon-weighted visions, where stratified and composite pictures introduced a new language into late 20th century painting that is seen in Basquiat's Untitled and Telemaque's Dérive Une, corresponded with an artistic goal of nonlinear storytelling and ruptured chronicles. There will be more to say about Jean-Michel Basquiat's 1981 Untitled, but what also supports my investigation of Basquiat as a visual poet is his interest in popular, mass-produced visual culture, such as commercial design, comic books, and cartoon animation. While there are many borrowed examples in his works from specific advertisements and cartoons, it is Basquiat's enthusiasm for the effects of four-color print reproduction technologies realized in colors, which, like in the classic DC Comics, inclined towards blended, all-inclusive palettes, that his paintings generated a polychromatic intentionality, as well as an ocular plenitude, moving in concert with and also sporadically upending the color wheel's standard progressions and color sequences. Basquiat made use of the comic's spare yet comprehensive chromatics to vault the conventions of mid to late 20th century art isms. And in place of these, he found his own respective sweet spots in painting. The works of Jean-Michel Basquiat combined figures and applications of pigments in shrewd placements and highly personal flourishes that, with lived histories and contemporary issues as focal points, extended color's reach beyond mere symbolism. These artistic statements, like the fragmented figures and fields inside his works, transcended painting's nexus to representationalism and instead entered a declarative place, even an oracular or poetic realm, on par with a cartoon superhero's fiery ray gun blast or an urban tagger's furious autographic torrents. In an interview about the parallels between his art and that of Jean-Michel Basquiat, Hervé Telemaque noted that there was common ground between many of Basquiat's works and his interest in signs, that their explorations of emblems were more elusive than figurative. These signs functioned like alphabets, language, or rhetoric, especially in the way they appeared on blank, tablet-like canvases and other painted surfaces. Is the black man still a caricature as in my work, or Basquiat's? Telemaque provocatively asked in his Museum of Modern Art published improvisation on Jean-Michel Basquiat. In any case, Telemaque continued, the idea is there, close to hand, in this assessment, not quite conceding to parody when exploring blackness, but neither dismissing the notion altogether. Hervé Telemaque's thoughts about Jean-Michel Basquiat must have first occurred when, about 40 years earlier, the young artist began showing internationally, and Telemaque would have noticed his paint stick representations of black bodies and their reverberations with comparable figures in his own work. Basquiat's major European debut, Documenta 7, the widely heralded quinquennial exhibition of international contemporary art in Kassel, Germany, showed several of his paintings alongside such art world luminaries as Joseph Beuys, Gerhard Richter, Cy Twombly, and Andy Warhol. But it was Basquiat's affinities with two additional painters, Keith Haring and Lee Quinones, and their connections to New York graffiti and street art that captured the attention of many critics. One must include among those using a linear mode graffiti artists, wrote reviewers about this subset of American exhibitors in Documenta 7, who are sometimes trained primitives and sometimes true ones. Basquiat, whom these same critics considered a true graffiti artist and a true primitive, purportedly produced some of the strongest paintings in the exhibition, but only insofar as they reflected his, quote, Twombly-esque lyrical qualities, a backhanded compliment, if not an insult, to the 21-year-old black artist. My work has nothing to do with graffiti, Jean-Michel Basquiat announced to an interviewer. It's painting. It always has been. I've always painted, well before painting was in fashion. Basquiat's distinction between his involvement with graffiti and what he considered his standing as an established painter is intriguing, a conceit that one might have dismissed as hubris were it not for paintings like the 1981 Untitled. His work was not really graffiti art from the streets, Diego Cortez, the art world notable and longtime champion of the artist, told the art historian and Basquiat specialist Jordana Moore-Sagesse, but rather graffiti-related studio art. While resonant with various aspects of urban graffiti, the 1981 Untitled brandished its fine arts credentials, foremost with its Judeo-Christian ecce homo subject, translated into paint stick and spray-painted cryptographs of a targeted and persecuted man. One understands Basquiat's emphatic sense of his work past and present as painting when taking into account the 1981 Untitled's inclusive palette, forming a patchwork beneath and above the artist's paint-augmented drawing. The multi-rod approach Jean-Michel Basquiat took in the 1981 Untitled and other early paintings showed an intuition about the medium and its post-abstract expressionist caliber to problematize process, an intervention pioneered by artists such as Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, Raymond Saunders, and Sam Gilliam. But Basquiat's incursions were radically conceived, as seen in his Boy and Dog in a Johnnypump, through the immediate and haptic nature of his singular, fervent imprimatur. The art critic and curator Glenn O'Brien recognized Basquiat's deep connections to the aesthetics of the streets and how he shares those affinities with his artistic elder, Raymond Saunders. These painters of blues, these collagist magicians, O'Brien designated Basquiat and Saunders, remind us of the immediate power of art to act on the mind and body directly through the senses, without explainers or translators, elevating the intellect, opening the heart, and stirring the soul. One might have assumed that a painting that indicated the presence of a Johnnypump, New York slang for a fire hydrant, would have shown the hydrant's cooling waters gushing onto bodies at leisure on the city's streets in the summertime. Jean-Michel Basquiat's Boy and Dog in a Johnnypump fulfilled that conjecture, but not in the way one might have expected. Instead, Basquiat's pigments superseded the painting's titular and figural components and introduced actions, iterations, and exchanges that, if not communicating watery relief on a sweltering New York street corner, conveyed an emphatic disposition and an intemperate alacrity. Sensations that Basquiat's orange, red, green, black palette further fueled, simplifying and abstracting recognizable realities to the point that they hovered between caricature and amorphia. Basquiat took graffiti's frenetic shorthand and, adding colors and expressive treatments, made Boy and Dog in a Johnnypump into a paean to the inner city, an impassioned infatuation that not even a hydrant's open valve could cool. I was trying to communicate an idea, Basquiat told interviewers in 1985 about his early work. I was trying to paint a very urban landscape, he stressed, in contrast to the mostly minimal, highbrow, and alienating works being created at that time. Basquiat added that he wanted to make very direct paintings that most people would feel the emotion behind when they saw them, thus the unrestrained nature of Boy and Dog in a Johnnypump. Jean-Michel Basquiat's 1983 Untitled was similarly peppered with these shorthand figures, but cast in such a way that rather than aestheticizing them, caricatured the bodies and accoutrements for the purposes of a tripartite word soup. Anatomical terminologies, Arabic and Roman numerals, the names of mythological people, Icarus, and real-life personages, the Roman Emperor Nero, the explorer Marco Polo, the jazz legend Miles Davis, floated in between outlined, bracketed, and scored mask-like faces. The effect was that of a tutorial gone off script, taking its vocabularies and illustrations into a black and blue abyss. The altarpiece canvases electrified by neon directionals, and again without clear-cut rules or targets. The outlier, a contrapposto female figure in the far left panel, brought a character from Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon into the lesson, along with a few vulgarities for women's body parts and a pale peach, racially encoded whiteness. Basquiat's 1983 Untitled did not need a more descriptive title. Its triptych specifying drafts, studies, and waxwings, that as provisional and random as they might have appeared, elevated his usurping of medicine and the art academy via what Robert Farris Thompson called the artist's high-octane blend of illusions and a graffiti-informed stream of consciousness, or what the cultural critic Greg Tate called Basquiat's broken down, bluesy, and neo-hoodoofied symbolist poems. In another Untitled painting, but with the parenthetical caption, Cadmium, Jean-Michel Basquiat also relied on the work's semiotic context to establish its interpretive parameters. While the 1983 Untitled was text abundant, Untitled Cadmium basked in a liberally plotted sequence of figures, symbols, and gestures, dominated by a cadmium red. Tellingly, what wasn't subsumed in red offered up intriguing ruminations on martyrdom and mercy, from the outwardly blind, mute, and armless torso of a man to a Sacred Heart's universal message of divine love through sacrifice and suffering. Impasto passages and incisive scrawls introduced scabs and strange idols that, in partnership with the painting's other components, conjured a foreboding coat of arms where the red field reminded audiences of life's eviscerating propensities. The man's sightless, white eye sockets, burning with more intensity than even the surrounding colors, met the spectator's gaze in a startling acknowledgement of not just life's figurative bloodletting, but everyone's complicity in the analogous en masse slaughter of the guilty and the innocent. For an artist who often erred towards excess, Basquiat's ample red intervals in Untitled Cadmium characterized the symbolic, corporeal loss. Cadmium Untitled was one of many paintings by Jean-Michel Basquiat, where the color red performed its outsized, visually assertive role. Looking at a somewhat concurrent work, Max Roach, one might surmise that the color was not monodenotative, that it suggested not only blood or fire, but a metaphysics emanating out of a late 20th century zeitgeist, or specifically, a Black cultural source. Named after the legendary bebop drummer and jazz composer, Max Roach approximated the paraphernalia of the famed percussionist as close as one might do so within an abstraction. The color red in Max Roach covered much of the canvas's surface, colliding against the adjacent colors and its recognizable figures with an electrifying onomatopoeia, not unlike Roach's celebratory oral musical potency. And yet one intuits from Basquiat's red something more atmospheric than purely synesthetic. Its dispersal not attached to syncopated rhythms, but rather to an outflowing and blanketing on par with a spatial or ambient inundation. In the 1980s, the same moment of Jean-Michel Basquiat's critical ascendancy, I labeled a Black cultural imprint on the visual arts past and present, the blues aesthetic, utilizing the idea of the classic African-American musical form as a paradigm upon which modern painters, sculptors, and other visual artists aligned their works. These connections, like Basquiat's signatory brushstroke and prototypical figures, moved between being explicitly narrational and open-ended. Characteristics that, while unsatisfactory to those looking for, to quote the art historian Kelly Jones, raised fists, a black image, or cultural nationalist stances, revealed a modern perspicuity as well as complexities, not unlike the vernacular yet profound musical genre, the blues. The blues, as the delta of Afro-American cultural reservoirs, I wrote in the introduction to the catalog, The Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture, and Modernism, spawns inlets of style that color a vast and graying ocean of Western tradition. My aquatic metaphors acknowledging the paint medium's lymphatic yet pervading characteristics and their implications for African American art. Basquiat's paint box, while repelling impulses to narrowly employ its hues for interpretive purposes, nevertheless produced pictures that, as seen in Max Roach's part illustrative, part enigmatic display, explored a modern condition via colors whose radiance, stimulants, and/or simulations touched experiential and philosophical chords within Black lives. Max Roach's Red Deluge and the selected crimson tides in other paintings were clearly enlisted by Jean-Michel Basquiat as the most efficacious vehicles for highlighting Black culture writ large and its ubiquity. Reminiscent of author Ishmael Reed's Jess Grew, the name for quickly proliferating Black cultural influences from his satirical 1971 novel Mumbo Jumbo, Basquiat's red flagged a veiled but pervasive Black expressivity, a factor that, although abstract, semiotically partnered with his forms to complete these layered, voluble pictures. The blues is a Jess Grew, Ishmael Reed wrote in Mumbo Jumbo. Jazz was a Jess Grew which followed the Jess Grew of ragtime. Slang is a Jess Grew too. One might add to Ishmael Reed's litany of Black aesthetic proliferations that, as seen in Jean-Michel Basquiat's monumental painting, New Nile, one bears witness to a red plus chromatic blackness, racial blackness, visual statement. Named after an early 20th century hair pomade, the sequence of images, text, and abstract forms in New Nile, largely rendered in red, black, and white, were a kind of contemporary hieroglyph communique, exploring many of Basquiat's customary themes and ideas from his other paintings. Although created 50 years before Max Roach, the Chicago modernist Archibald J. Motley Jr.'s Saturday Night also relied on a panoptic red to invoke a Depression-era jazz and blues transformed African-American milieu. Anecdote abounding as opposed to non-representational, Saturday Night nevertheless tapped a sanguine palette to transmit a vitalism that, parallel to the work's Painting the Town Red allegory and its cabaret setting, joined Basquiat's Max Roach in capturing the jazz life's puissance. As noted in Basquiat's predecessor and aesthetic kin, painter Raymond Saunders, red plus racial blackness often had latent deleterious associations. However, as seen in Motley and Basquiat's paintings, there are occasions when red and Africanity transcended its stereotypic sequiturs, and paraphrasing the artist and color theorist Joseph Albers, called forth a spectrum of psychological and cultural insinuations. Another picture where the color red served combustive yet foundational purposes, a tripartite untitled painting. He has so many untitled paintings, it's hard to keep up with them all. A tripartite untitled painting on wood paneling elucidated Jean-Michel Basquiat's answer in 1983 to curator Henry Geldzahler's question about his artwork's primary subject matter. Royalty, heroism, and the streets was Basquiat's reply, each present in varying degrees in the 1985 Untitled, with red and other colors supporting the imagery that explored those themes. Chief among the 1985 Untitled figures and occupying the center panel was an abstracted cape and headdress adorned being mounted on an equine creature. Above this equestrian figure and spanning all three panels was the profile of a big spotted cat, teeth bared, and mostly orange, yellow, and red. Apart from these elements and the vegetal and kinetic accents scattered throughout, the 1985 Untitled's right panel included a grinning, one-eyed, amphibious black creature, its esophagus and stomach visibly rendered with white pigment. Lizzie Himmel's February 10, 1985 New York Times Magazine cover photo portrait of Basquiat included an unfinished version of Untitled, showing the initial major components of the painting, as well as the unworked areas that Basquiat would eventually augment with supplemental features. Basquiat's additions to the 1985 Untitled, the deep red areas, the sunflower yellow diagonals, the flayed and pelt-like oranges, and the imperial teal square and lower left and right panel perimeters, powered the embryonic composition and charted its destiny. The white, silver, and gray wooden paneling upon which his chromatic actions would find front row positions betrayed and often ignored design awareness on Basquiat's part. Like the white and silver in Basquiat's Max Roach, achromatic and metallic colors served not just as foils for the adjacent highly saturated hues. They introduced an industrial feeling that countered any knee-jerk primitivizing predispositions towards the picture's content. But this element was nevertheless moderated by Basquiat's fountainhead of narrative-driven content, Haiti's divine horseman, Africa's veneration of wild cats, and the greater Black Atlantic's love-hate relationship with the trickster persona. The 1985 Untitled brought these prototypes to the fore, but while the writer and Leopard alternatively addressed his objective to portray sovereignty and intrepidness, the grinning black creature on the right panel referenced an entirely different yet frequently represented subject in Basquiat's paintings, fate, rendered as a black, slow-eyed cipher whose rapacious, toothy smirk inferred contempt and predation. Throughout the African diaspora, this avatar of unpredictability, mortality, and judgment emerged in various names and guises. Among the devotees of Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé, Eshu and Eshu, respectively, in Haitian Vodou, Legba and Gede, and in the African-American United States, the devil. Basquiat fashioned his own representations of this entity as early as 1984, recognizable in paintings like Gold Griot. Here, more cadaver than amphibian, Basquiat's embodiment of fate grinned or grimaced from a metallic golden birth, a color whose name also had alchemical, money-generating powers, he told Henry Geldzahler, perhaps with a touch of irony, given that the curator's Germanic etymologically translated name is counter of money. Placing this ghastly, mocking creature within chromatic splendor might seem incongruous, but as one contemplates the idea of fool's gold and the inflated accolades that traditional West African griots conferred on susceptible listeners, then Basquiat conceived a fitting 1980s moral subject in Gold Griot. Close scrutiny of Gold Griot revealed poetic touches, from a pentimento of gesturing limbs within the engulfing gold, to the figure's nostrils morphing into a tiny automobile and its teeth into musical keys. Metamorphoses that, given the work's innuendo to a West African troubadour storyteller, hinted at the flights of fancy and the unreliability of narrations with which audiences contend. In her essay, Lost in Translation, Jean-Michel in the Remix, Kelly Jones traced the lineage of this specter through numerous paintings and drawings, likening its silhouette to a masked DC comic superhero, an African power object, and a figurated charm. In Jean-Michel Basquiat's imaging system, all of these characterizations played their part, and yet its alien contours, vacuous facial orifices, and pitch black color inferred something malevolent, not stereotypically diabolical, but in the ethos of West Africa's influential Yoruba culture, a spiritual force whose dominion over misfortune and deliverance made it an ambivalent presence. This creature, with its digestive tract on full display, held its own alongside the warrior and predator in Basquiat's 1985 Untitled, and a year later in the artist's Jim Crow. In the latter, it simultaneously succumbed to and reigned over an American system of segregation and disenfranchisement, boldly announced by the colloquial Jim Crow paraphrase in correlation to the innocuous names of waterways, extant and obliterated, and to the longitudinal lines of racial demarcation, again delineated and erased. These references to rivers demonstrated that Basquiat, who was often perceived as detached from harsher Black realities, was familiar with the lore surrounding estuaries as the boundaries between African-American destiny and doom, and as the watery graves of Black men who threatened Jim Crow's de facto governance over Black lives. As if captioning Gold Griot, the 1985 Untitled, and Jim Crow, the Black arts movement poet David Nelson presciently wrote about this personification in his poem, "Today is a Killer." And this is a quote from that poem. "Pressing his ugly face against mine, staring at me with lifeless eyes, crumbling away all memories of yesterday's dreams, crumbling away hopes and destroying wishes, destroying dreams," end of quote. Unlike Gold Griot, the phthalo and ultramarine blue acrylics that formed the Mississippi in Jean-Michel Basquiat's Jim Crow did not delimit its sinister apparition. They flowed behind and around fate's disembodied mask and were engulfed by a whitewashed fence featuring the incantatory names of the Mississippi and other fluvial crossroads. This same creature was revisited in subsequent works by Jean-Michel Basquiat, most notably in Gris-Gris. But here a brown figure has replaced the Black ones, and what were previously colorful and multi-figured platforms has become minimalist, with its nominal colors and brushwork acquiring a weight and import that invite further reflection. Rust-colored strokes, in addition to delineating the creature's eye and mouth, fashioned from top to bottom and upper perimeter, a coiled line terminating in nodules, and two perpendicular keyhole-like forms. These marks put the finishing touches on this entity in ways comparable to how the white lines completed the Black creature in Basquiat's 1985 Untitled. Not only does this reddish hue complete Gris-Gris, affixing extremities to an otherwise limbless figure, but it provided a chromatic and compositional transition from the white, brown, and blackish areas, facilitating a reading of the creature that conformed to the talismanic suppositions of its title. Coming into view in a white void within a dark, depthless expanse, Basquiat's brown and russet being, in spite of its deformities and menacing countenance, embodied potentiality, a glimmer of holiness made even more imaginable by its loosely drawn halo, framing the head inside the white space like an afterthought. Although part of Jean-Michel Basquiat's throng of fatalist figures, Gris-Gris's particularities were clearly informed by a West African figural sculpture that the artist acquired during an August 1986 trip to Abidjan, the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, for an exhibition his art dealer had organized there at the French Cultural Institute. Called Kafidejelejo, or He Who Speaks the Truth, and shown in a photograph by Ching-Kwang Chi, sitting amongst Basquiat's paints and brushes in his New York studio. These figures are considered by the Senufo peoples representations of invisible bush spirits, and they ritually operated as oracles or diviners, exposing crimes, bringing to light false testimonies, and pinpointing guilt. Whether or not Basquiat knew the alleged competencies of these sculptures, one can imagine that upon encountering one, he saw remarkable similarities between their mysterious forms and his own abstracted figures. Offering a kind of transatlantic confirmation of the sign-like elements in Basquiat's paintings, this effigy gave palpable form to the artist's messaging. The perpendicular reddish keyholes at the bottom of Gris-Gris symbolically offering an entree into Basquiat's precarious, street-savvy worldview. If Gris-Gris exemplified Jean-Michel Basquiat's entry into an iconographic but more elemental realm, Eschu adumbrated the artist's flight into an ecstatic, spontaneous orbit. Basing the painting on popular characterizations of Eschu, the superficially demonic but morally equivocal crossroads spirit from the Afro-Brazilian religion Candomblé, Basquiat deconstructed the figure and its characteristics through repetition, outlining, and automatism, the latter evident in the painting's gratuitous scrawls and slapdash colors on white canvas. Ching-Kwang Chi's 1987 photo portrait of Basquiat, sequestered on all sides by his painting, art supplies, and a collection of African art and musical instruments, succinctly captured the position in which the artist found himself towards the end of his life, struggling to meet the demands that fast-track success levied. Ritually entreated to arrange liaisons, impose justice, or maintain life's equilibrium by Candomblé's spiritual adherents, Basquiat's Eschu stood sentry among flaming colors and a swarm of flying, intrusive eyes. Eschu's name transformed into a ballot box where the letter X indicated the artist's vote in this moment for emancipation and escape. Words and shapes have always gotten along, Hervé Telemaque observed in the context of text-image drifts, such as those in Basquiat's Eschu. And once again, we have a complicity between painters and poets. Basquiat, Telemaque says, is a Baroque Caribbean poet among North American Protestants. Jean-Michel Basquiat's late career odes to poetry and painting, Eroica II and Eroica I, as their Beethoven Symphony No. 3 titles suggested, assumed a likewise conceptual grandeur despite their mostly oil paint stick on paper fabrication. Eroica II and Eroica I are ideally read as a diptych, and despite numbered in such a way that suggests a temporal sequencing, the reverse order actually joins Basquiat's continuous brushstrokes from both sheets of paper. Basquiat's friend Erica Bell explained to Jordana Morsegesi several key aspects of the Eroica paintings, in particular, the repeated renderings of the paper and pencil hangman game motif, and Basquiat's colloquialisms and their definitions from a, quote, African-American slang dictionary. Bell was likely referring to the 1987 edition of Clarence Major's Black Slang, a dictionary of Afro-American talk, from which Basquiat took about 20 words, starting with the letter B and their definitions. Basquiat's featured slang definitions from bang, injection of narcotics or sex, to bat and old woman offered their own autobiographical loaded avenues of inquiry. However, it is through a full consideration of this diptych that one can grasp the artist's dedication to a truly hybrid art form, where words, definitions, pictures, abbreviations, numerals, characters, and pigment-saturated flourishes all created something poetic and symphonic. But rather than a highbrow orchestral work, this ode to heroism was akin to an explosive chemical compound. And as notified throughout, it emerged from a vernacular African-American chorale and blues milieu. The African-American slang that Basquiat employed in the Eroica paintings functioned like a list poem, words and their meanings that created alliterative word columns whose multiple entry points, informational, systemic, personal, and structural, demonstrated the artist's depth and creativity. Chromatically, the Eroica paintings are spare in irregular, frugal applications of black, red-orange, and shades of white and blue. Eroica I's reddish hotspots were the only instances of chromatic dominance. Otherwise, scattered colored mixtures such as off-white, light blue, and pale pink predominate, with a sprawling Vulcan blue and white acrylic passage that moved across the two surfaces with a tonal dissonance comparable to the rough voices and minor key instrumentations that one hears in blues music. Constantly queried in the French press about Jean-Michel Basquiat, especially after Jean-Michel Basquiat's death in 1988, Hervé Telemaque eventually created an homage to the younger artists. Josette et Jean-Michel was an abstract construction of three parallel collage fiberboard standees, joined by two half-cylindrical bases and partially covered in coffee residue and lacquer paint in multiple colors. Sharing the commemorative stage with Basquiat was the artist's late sister and an amateur artist herself, Josette Telemaque Murat, compositionally flanked in the sculpture between an undulating blue cutout representing Basquiat, as suggested by its tri-chevron crown and almond-shaped eyes, and a wheel gear-styled standee in assorted hues and shades. Rhythmic yet heterogeneous, Josette et Jean-Michel zeroed in on the eyes from Basquiat's black and brown creatures, matching their inscrutability with Telemaque's chromatic distractions and stagecraft scenery. Beyond the ironic nod to a colonial commodity Telemaque stated about his use of coffee grounds in this and other painted constructions, I exploit the pictorial value of coffee as I pervert the use of pigments, by which he meant that his colors in Josette and Jean-Michel, green, yellow, red, black, and different shades of blue, lavender, and brown, conjured a tropical delirium, but sequestered within emblematic forms and industrial materials. Francophone curators and critics paved the way for comparing the paintings of Hervé Telemaque with those of Jean-Michel Basquiat, noticing not only their shared Haitian lineages, but discerning in both a dual interest in signs and languages, not necessarily for their communicative function, but for their multimodal actions and visual labor. Within a notable body of work, both in their own way, have been crossed by different artistic currents and have integrated objects into their creations, wrote Régine Cousin. However, she continued, the particular approximation of their work would relate more to references that are not only graphic or aesthetic, but which appear in visual messages showing their attraction for writing and painting, or painting and writing. Cousin's astute observation about Basquiat and Telemaque's fusions of the painterly and the poetic were within the French context undergirded by the semiotic theories of scholars such as Roland Barthes. Language, Barthes writes, is comprised of larger fragments of discourse referring to objects or episodes whose significations or their social and psychological corollaries bolstered speech and text, a perspective both Telemaque and Basquiat acknowledged, whether in their evocative figures or in their bountiful and indicial colors. The Haitian critic Jacques Gorgou has similarly suggested that Hervé Telemaque's text accentuated works and his overtures to poetic elements were, quote, the foundation of the shifts in meaning and form. A context surrounds a form, Gorgou continued, but despite multiple evocations, the form does not possess its own meaning. Everything depends upon the net of metaphors in which Telemaque imprisons the form. A comparable observation can be made, perhaps, of Basquiat's Eroica I and Eroica II, where his listings of Black slang are enveloped by the artist's signature-like obliterations and highlights. Hervé Telemaque was one of the few painters of color actively participating in the 1960s European pop art scene, with his predispositions to, one, socio-political commentary, and two, a theory of signs. He continued making art that interrogated social systems and their insignia, incorporating abstract abridgments, and of particular importance for my talk, inserting into painting cultural reference and syntactical structures from the African diaspora that introduced redolent palettes and contemporary philosophies into art. Like a cyclone from the Atlantic, Jean-Michel Basquiat's presence jolted how the world viewed late 20th century painting and American art in general. The work's materialization from urban graffiti and a hip-hop aesthetic was the stuff of modern mythology and a curative for both Eurocentrism and race-class hierarchies in the United States. But what made Basquiat significant and what continues to intrigue the art world about his creations was his furtherance and reinforcement of post-World War II art brut, reimagined by the painter via an assortment of dispersive strategies such as writing, reiteration, erasure, and automatism, as well as particular themes and preoccupations: history, martyrdom, urbanism, hero worship, corporeality, fatalism, linguistics, the analysis of signs, etc. Separated by 20 plus years, two distinct professional trajectories and individual, radically different approaches to art, Hervé Telemaque's and Jean-Michel Basquiat's worlds and art views amply informed their respective works to merit joint membership in an academy in which painting's after effects reflected its status based on color, and in Telemaque's words, based on a renewal for the spirit that justifies daring and my complete freedom. My talk this evening concludes with an excerpt from Ready to Burst, a novel by the Haitian writer Franck Etienne, whose decision to officially combine his first and last names mirrored the fissured works of Hervé Telemaque and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Similarly, Franck Etienne's writings, including Ready to Burst, foregrounded worlds and individuals whose colorful, chaotic existences find many parallels in the paintings discussed this evening. Ready to Burst is about two young men, one who has recently been deported back to Haiti and is eventually imprisoned, and the other who is a writer struggling to create something he knows from the outset is doomed. The novel moves between realist depictions of everyday struggles and abstract fragments, as gleaned from the following excerpt. Stumbling against a piece of broken concrete, he falls down in the intersection of Jean-Jacques Dessalines Boulevard and Fontford Street. He keeps rolling, then comes to a complete stop. On his back, his body a blazing torch, his limbs burst of flames, his head on fire, a flaming mass filled with exploding shells. Eyes open, he looks at the center of the street whizzing by like wagons jammed, packed together, mounted on rails like a high-speed train, an express train to the sea. It's funny, I'm taking the Midnight Design Express. It's beautiful, this above-ground landscape of neon signs. The sky chopped into ragged pieces. Neon flowers light up, shut off, light up again. Blue, red, green, yellow, how quickly it goes by. this silent, freewheeling train to the dock, blue-green, blue-red, deep yellow. This passage paints a tumultuous Port-au-Prince and a portrait of one of its wayfarers, an individual with kaleidoscopic insights to which Basquiat and Telemaque were also attuned, and reminiscent of Frank Etienne, found colors and forms to effectively articulate these visions. I am not afraid of chaos because chaos is the womb and light and life, Banksquiat said, as if captioning Jean-Michel Basquiat's painting Victor 25448. Another episode from several of his late career paintings on the themes of crack-ups and chromatic exegeses. The yellowish, brownish, and greenish stains to the painting's far left were themselves a type of inscription, evoking abstract expressionism, neo-expressionism, and the ink marker articulations and aphorisms on inner city surfaces. These stains almost eclipsed opposite Basquiat's own landscape of neon signs and their red, yellow, blue acrylic swabs were highly personal traces, or the residue from a symbolic ceremonial spray of Caribbean rum for Basquiat, who, like Telemaque, was an interrogator of signs and languages, and upon his demise would become an ancestor, or in the Haitian Creole, a zancette. Basquiat's knocked out and bruised brown figure in Victor 25448, in only a few years having mutated from a grinning black trickster African oracle, plummeted amidst the double-edged messages of perfection, as if presaging Basquiat's own fragile preeminence and the talented New York hooligan label Telemaque quixotically conferred on him just months before his death. What made Jean-Michel Basquiat and Hervé Telemaque two eccentric ecumenical colorists, candidates for this talk's shotgun wedding, was a common cultural wellspring and ambition for painting these chromatic dispatches and a mutual deference for improvisation and paint's penultimate gravitational volition. Thank you.